Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. So, as you can see, I'm back home in Vienna, and as with keeping with the new season, this is also filmed. So, hello to anyone watching this on YouTube. But for those who are just listening, hello as well. Nothing really changes. It's just if you want to see me talk about some of this stuff, see my face, I'm on YouTube, so check it out. And the other thing that I'm doing differently this season is that I am doing live streams. So what I'm planning on doing is sort of scheduling it. Every Sunday, I think every Sunday sounds good, I'm going to do a live stream wherein, if there's anything that you hear me talk about, you want to hear me talk about more, you have questions or anything else, you can ask me there. It'll be on YouTube, Sundays, 8 p.m. CET. And yeah, it'll be a chill kind of, better way to sort of or a new way, an expanded way to explore some of the things I'm talking about. And also because, as I said in the last episode, I do have a tendency sometimes to go too deep into something, and then kind of get burnt out. But then once I re-listen back, I realize fuck, I did not say that huge aspect of the thing I wanted to talk about. So yeah, I'll talk more about it on the live streams, which will happen every Sunday at 8 p.m. CET. Follow me on Blue Sky or Instagram to see updates on that, or to get notifications, or subscribe to From the Periphery on YouTube so you get notifications directly from there. So yeah, I really enjoyed the last one. I think I'm going to enjoy streaming. It's much less isolating than this whole thing, which I kind of enjoy, but at the same time, this can get a bit lonely because it's just me and a microphone and kind of go off my own steams. Anyway, so today's episode, the title of which I think is very important, it took me a while to sort of come up with it, is talking a lot about Lebanon, the current state of things, which is honestly really intensely fucked. There is this huge need, in my opinion, of a critical analysis of the situation, because things are honestly really gloomy. It is for the region, with the kind of emboldening of US imperialism, with the sort of increased hegemony of the Israelis, but also other things as well that I'm going to talk a lot about, which I hesitate a bit to, and I'm going to tread very lightly because things are really fucked. Parts of the South are still occupied, which I'll talk a bit about later. There is essentially a new order, and to some, this is a moment of euphoria, which I find nauseating, obnoxious, just horrible. And to others, there's just, I don't know. I'm going to talk a lot about it. But basically, I'm going to talk about current events in Lebanon, connecting it obviously to recent developments in Syria, but also in Palestine, because all these things are connected as fuck. And I do think eventually, inevitably, this is going to become quite a Lebanese-centric podcast because I'm Lebanese, but also basically I'll be talking a lot about the internal discourse on Lebanon, but I'm very aware that most people listening to this podcast are not Lebanese, possibly not from the region as a whole. And so I want to do a thing of kind of presenting sort of unique perspectives, or a leftist perspective, a critical perspective on Lebanon that is both accessible to people who aren't that familiar, but also in a way that's critical enough that it's involved in the discussion. Because I've got a lot of thoughts, and honestly, it's very intense and it's very difficult to say some things. And I've had to do a lot of thinking and a lot of just very, literally just sitting thinking, planning, thinking, sort of analyzing in my mind. And a part of it is I feel very lonely because I cannot see, and I have not yet read any thorough analysis that makes me feel, yeah, that's, you know, there are sort of snippets here and there, but ultimately I just feel kind of alone in some of this, like, thinking. Anyway, I am going to tread very lightly, not only because the sort of like discursive atmosphere is a bit intense, but the situation is intense, and there is just a lot of fucking trauma and grief and frustrations and fears, which are all very legitimate. And I don't want to analyze them away. I want to hold space for them in the analysis. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Lebanon, liberation, and sovereignty, which for some reason seems to be, not easy to mesh together. Regardless, before I get into that, I have a brief announcement. Again, in this season, I'm going to restrict my announcements to one per episode so that I don't like overwhelm, but also that I give each one its moment. This announcement is that I have a podcast. Not this podcast, not the Mutual Aid podcast, but a third podcast wherein I tell funny stories. If you like any of the digressions I get into, if you just like listening to my voice, if you like hearing absurd, very thematic, kind of real stories, I have an entire series of Keep This Between Us. It's 15 episodes. I'm calling it season 1. You're probably seeing a trend. I don't know. It's been helpful just having like a package. Season 1, it's on Patreon. It's available for members, but if you don't want to be a member, you can purchase it for, I think, $8 or $10. It's 15 episodes, which I think is about like 10 hours of content. And there's some of my favorite stories to tell. Absurd, weird, Beirut, random bullshit. Yeah. So I think the last episode I'm going to put up is the 16th episode, and that'll be series 1. It's available on Patreon. It's called Keep This Between Us. And yeah, check it out if you want to listen to funny, absurd, thematic stories narrated by yours truly. So that's the announcement. So, let's see. Headlines. On the 11th of February, the Jordanian king, King Abdullah II, went to the White House and visited Donald Trump. And it was embarrassing. It was, there's a German word for it. It's not Schadenfreude. I think it's like what's the word? I love this word, but it's basically like vicarious embarrassment. You know, you feel embarrassed for him because basically he just looked so weak. And Trump was sitting there saying horrendous shit about the Palestinians and his plans for literally ethnically cleansing Palestine, and, you know, that the Jordanians should take in Palestinians. And the Jordanian king, Abdullah, just kind of couldn't handle it. He kind of had like a stress reaction with his blinking, which I'd never seen before. And it was kind of a shit show. It's very hard. I want to say some things, but also constantly hold space for the fact that the plans that Trump is talking about is not just like far-fetched whatever. This is what the Israelis have been working towards. This is what they're doing. And basically, ethnic cleansing, genocide, mass deportation, mass depopulation of Palestinians, which needs to be confronted and rejected and stopped. Like, this has been the whole thing since ever. With all that said, there's been this very strange response by some people on the left to kind of like give their solidarity to the Jordanian monarchy. The Jordanian monarchy itself has issued certain statements rejecting Trump's proposals, same with the Egyptians. But there is basically, I've been trying to find a term for it. I think this is the Jordanian and Egyptian regimes, like chickens coming home to roost. Is that a phrase? Rooster coming home to roost? What is it? Basically, in their statements, which is ridiculous, they talk about Palestinian rights and international law and the two-state solution, which to me is one of the most delusional constructs in this entire thing. Has always been, but especially now. And they both of them say this one thing, which I think is the real thing, which is this plan. If 1 million Palestinians were kicked out, 2 million into Egypt, and like a bunch of I don't know how many million in the West Bank, like 5 million into Jordan, that it would threaten internal stability. That's what it's all about. That's what it's always been about. That is the very core of the alliance between the Hashemite monarchy, between the Jordanian king, and the Israelis. This has been true since at least the 30s, since the sort of like covert agreements that the Hashemite monarchy signed with the Israelis, with the Zionists in 1947, the kind of the partition plan, wherein the Jordanians would essentially get one half of Palestine, and the Zionists would get another, and the Egyptians would get Gaza. So basically what's happening now, and why the Egyptians and the Jordanians are kind of shitting themselves, and why I think it's basically ridiculous for anyone to be claiming solidarity with the Jordanian monarchy or the Egyptians, the Egyptian regime, is that both regimes have been incredibly complicit in Zionism. The Egyptians, not just Zionism, but in the ongoing genocide. The Egyptians were part of the siege of Gaza for years, ever since Sisi took over. But most crucially, since the genocide, the genocidal war, started on October 7. They were part of the siege. The Jordanians, for their part, have used their land route to the Israelis let the land route to get in aid to ease, the hardships that they're experiencing from the Red Sea blockade by the Houthis. But I mean, it's so much more structural than that. And basically what I see happening now, why they're shitting themselves, why it's a bit interesting, is because essentially by accepting the genocidal violence, the genocidal war, and participating in it, what the Jordanians and the Egyptians were saying was basically like, oh, okay, you want to do that now, okay, do it, but keep it over there. As in, they were expecting that the fascistic violence that is being unleashed onto the Palestinians of Gaza will stop at Gaza. It won't. Nobody is saying it will, not least of which the Israelis. And so basically now it's kind of turned around. Their complicity in Zionism is turning around to bite them in their ass. And now with Trump threatening to cut military aid, this would destroy and dismantle, this would make the regimes incredibly vulnerable. And they already are. They are propped up by US and EU aid. And so that happened, and those are my thoughts on the matter. And like I say in my video essay, which hopefully by next week will be out on YouTube. For everyone else, it is still on Patreon for members and for one-time purchase. But I talk about this at a kind of historical level, that these regimes are, the Jordanian monarchy is not just bad on this issue or has bad policies, but very structurally is a necessity for the maintenance of Zionism in the region, for the ongoing kind of US whatever. And they get a lot of US aid, military aid, And without that, yeah, they're not really going to have the same hold on their state. And so what I talk about in the video essay is there's a necessity, and there used to be a lot more vocal kind of like discussion of this, of like advocating for revolution in these places and overthrow of these regimes as part of the sort of like quest to liberate Palestine. Anyway, so what else is there? Oh, a couple of days ago, the Israelis, so second headline for today, February 18 marked the end of the extension of the ceasefire agreement in the south of Lebanon, which meant that the Israelis were meant to completely withdraw from the south. They left several villages and several areas, and the 18th saw like the liberation of some of these areas, the army entering, the sort of citizens, the residents returning home often to find incredible amounts of destruction, unfathomable amounts of destruction, much of which happened not during the war, but during the ceasefire. But the Israelis are insisting on maintaining 5 key sort of strategic points in the south, which again is another basically extension of the occupation of the south. Obviously in contravention to not only this agreement, but to like every principle of international law, of like the very basis of like the sovereignty of a state. And so that's incredibly fucked. But on top of that, the last few weeks, every few days, we'd see videos of massive destruction, sort of like planned destruction in the south. And one day before the ceasefire extension deadline ended, the Israelis assassinated a Hamas official in Saido. And this is essentially the status quo that they want to normalize, and they want us to accept, which is kind of part of the ceasefire agreement that was signed, which kind of stipulated essentially that the Israelis have the right, or through this monitoring system, which is complete bullshit, to do targeted assassinations, which means, you know, like using a drone to bomb a car on the main highway of Saido at rush hour or whatever. Like, all of it is illegitimate. All of it is just completely fucking unacceptable. But anyway, this is essentially the kind of like status quo that they want to accept, that beyond the war, beyond the ceasefire, that they hold the right to just bomb a target, to bomb an area, to bomb a house, to bomb a car. And as we've seen, they need no justification. Anyway, so this is the ceasefire. I think at this point there has been about 1,000 violations of the ceasefire by the Israelis. But of course, what we're going to see is that probably there's going to be another response by Hezbollah, that the Israelis will claim, you know, cast this belly on, like, oh, see, they're violating it now, so there's no more agreement. This is basically the Israeli formula to like strangle so intensely and get away with so many things that then elicits a response by which then they claim like, oh, look at it. I can't stand it. Sorry, this has basically been the repeated theme of the Israelis since the fucking 40s. Anyway, like, be literally the aggressor and constantly claim defense. I know this is like old discourse, but regardless, it's like a new reality in Lebanon, and it's fucking terrifying. Part of the reasons I fucking left Lebanon is like, I saw this coming. Like, you could see the writings on the wall with the Israelis and where that society and that state is heading towards. But also, I mean, honestly, just at a kind of like emotional, psychic, whatever level, the Israeli jets, I talk about this a lot. And a few days ago, they did, you know, they I don't know what the verb is, but they did 2 sonic booms over Beirut. Just constant harassment. Like, this is terrorism. There is no political goal. This is pure just like breeding terror into the general population. And it's fucking scary. Like, anyway, I'll talk more about this later on. I'm still in the headline phase, funny enough. Is there anything else that happened in the last like 10 days that's worth marking on? I mean, there's just so much. What I really need to do is do these episodes more regularly. Maybe in the live stream. Anyway, I guess I'll leave it just at those 2. So, for the main part of this episode, I'm going to talk about Lebanon. Okay, so Lebanon. It's not the first time I'll talk about Lebanon for sure, but it's always difficult. Not only because like I'm from there, and so I have a very real personal stake with these things, and like with what happens in Lebanon, the direction or things that, you know what I mean, like the situation in general. And so it's hard not to get emotional. But also it is a complex place. It's where simple narratives go to die. And so that's why some like remaining slogans I find a bit frustrating, wherein I don't see the analysis behind it. I don't see like a thorough understanding of the current situation, but also of the history, even the short history. It is also very contentious. It is very difficult to say certain things. And so, as I said in the offset, I am going to sort of like bite my tongue a little bit, just so for the time being to have a kind of, I don't know, certain framework. I want to establish certain things. What is happening? What's changed? You know, in the last few months, there have been seismic shifts in the region and in Lebanon. And there are a lot of moving pieces. And at the same time, there is a lot of blood that's been spilt. And so it's very fucking difficult to have a clear picture, or at least make sense of it all, while also holding space for the martyrdoms, the destruction, the constantly still like humiliation, and violence. But so what I'm going to do is sort of give a bit of an overview, talk about things, and I think if there's any analysis, it's going to be around sovereignty. I decided to title this episode Sovereignty Without Liberation, because that for sure, I think, is a discourse that exists in Lebanon, and part of the kind of like movements within government that I think really speak to the heart of like the problems that a lot of us have with the Lebanese state. It's definitely something that I can speak towards comfortably. But I think, yeah, there's certain shortcomings and short-sightedness and contradictions. Sovereignty is not, like, if you look at the discourse in the moment, you will see a lot of discussions of sovereignty and a lot of use of the term. But it's not new. Sovereignty is definitely something that, I mean, it's a core component of every single state. It is essentially kind of one of the core facets of a state. And it is something that Lebanon has never really had. I think, I mean, there are colonial reasons for why that is, in terms of like the makeup of the Levant, but also very specifically with like the introduction of Zionism into the region, and ultimately with the Nakba of 1948, that I think there are certain things about the very nature of these states that kind of ignores reality, and ignores the reality of continued imperialism in the region, and the very fact that these states are just like colonial fucking constructs that like, I don't know. God, honestly, it is so difficult talking about Lebanon sometimes. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is talk about what's happened in the last 2 weeks. Some key events. I'm going to try as hard as possible not to add too much analysis, because I want to set a kind of framework before then getting into analysis that I might do in this episode, I might do later. So why have I done this episode now? Because over the last week, there have been protests in front of the airport that have really sparked a lot of discussions that are a bit all over the place. Why did these protests happen? There was a plane going from Iran to Beirut airport that was sort of told not to take off. Why? Because the Israelis have been claiming for a very long time, not a very long time, a few months now, and they've been like sort of putting in stories in the Wall Street Journal and a bunch of other these like really fucked up rags that Iran is using civilian planes to funnel money to Hezbollah. So the Israelis said that if this plane were to land, we will bomb the airport. The Lebanese government took this threat seriously and prevented the airplane from taking off. This is wholly unacceptable. This is a breach of sovereignty. This is brutal, threats of aggression, which is just in violation of like the most basic principles of, the UN Charter, international law. And so there was a mobilization of protests, that from the beginning was very sectarian. Very specifically, a lot of Hezbollah flags, some Amal flags. And the chants were like the most sectarian possible, literally just Shia, which, I first heard that chant when, a bunch of partisans of these political parties came down to beat us up in the October 17 revolution, uprising, whatever you want. And it wasn't just a protest, but also like it got a bit intense. They set fire to a UNIFIL car. The UNIFIL is the United Nations like interim force in Lebanon. Kind of these people who are in the south who don't do much. They just kind of like monitor or whatever. The Israelis have been trying to get rid of them as well. And they were confronted by the army and the riot police, who shot tear gas and were like violent because the riot police are like that. And yeah. So that's one thing that's happened. Yeah. On the second or third day, it was like overtly endorsed by Hezbollah, these protests. Even though apparently this isn't the first time that a plane from Iran has been forbidden from taking off because of Israeli threats. But apparently because it was a different minister at the time who was in charge of this, a minister who was part of Hezbollah. So there are some people who describe this as a kind of spontaneous protest that's born from people's real frustrations with the situation, not just with the Israeli occupation, not just with the aggression that has just finished, but also with the kind of capitulation of the government with this new government. There are others who say that this is mobilized by Hezbollah as a kind of, recouping of an image, because they have faced a lot of setbacks. They have faced a lot of losses, a lot of defeats, not just with the recent aggression, with the assassination of Nasrallah, and then after him, Safiuddin, but also just, the entire chain of command has just been like kind of obliterated. And a part of that was the Pagers attack. Like the start of it was the Pagers attack, which again is like so fucking frustrating that it is just kind of celebrated by the West. And just like without comment that Netanyahu gifts Trump a kind of golden pager. It is just honestly one of the most brazen acts of like imperialist terrorism in the last whatever. But regardless, there's also this feeling like there's these setbacks or this feeling of a kind of diminished Hezbollah because of the fall of Assad. And not just the fall of Assad, but now with Shar'a, kind of the new president, really signaling a kind of westward turn, meeting with a lot of honestly, it's been kind of really fucking problematic. He's been meeting with like straight up neocons. I saw his foreign minister, the new foreign minister of Syria, an interview with like Tony Blair. And I find that fucking disgusting. I don't know. I mean, no one really had that much hopes for Shara and for people around him. But regardless, that's a whole other thing. But as like the core ally of Hezbollah, the fall of Assad is like a seismic shift. But also signals that, I mean, but why does it matter that much? Because, well, I mean, Hezbollah intervened in Syria on behalf of the Assad regime in 2013 as part of the counter-revolutionary war. And they stayed there until basically, literally until December 8th of last year, when the offensive in the north and then the sort of rising up in the south kind of forced out Assad, but also his allies. Honestly, there's not enough discussion about how that decision to cast themselves like into, like alongside Assad was a kind of, there's definitely a word, a fait accompli or whatever. They were like, it was a gamble. And I think there are many reasons why that was like fucked. Not just like literally at a kind of like, I don't know, human level, but strategically as well. This was not a stable regime. This was a sort of oppression that caused like created so much resistance and it was like doomed to fall. And the end result is now, like, talk to any Syrian, they fucking hate Hezbollah. There's like not a single Syrian I have ever met. You know, like Assad his regime was falling, was collapsing. And the interventions by Hezbollah, then by Iran, then by Russia, propped it up. And all this endless, unnecessary fucking deaths. But so, with the fall of Assad, this is another sort of like mark that sort of has weakened Hezbollah. And so it's in this context that those who seek a kind of, who talk about sovereignty, who talk about statehood, you know, and like literally the president comes up and talks about like his mandate is monopolization of violence, which is another core facet of a state. It's in this context with a kind of weakened Hezbollah. I personally do not see the euphoria in all of this, though. The kind of like excellent, because I think states are horrible entities that also like we're not factoring into the entire concept of like the class war that has been engaged in Lebanon for the last, since ever, but specifically the last 5 years. And I think the function of the state is not to really combat that. The best thing that this sort of new revived technocratic government can hope for is to kind of like balance the books, make things a bit whatever. Yeah, get US and EU aid, even though that's even in like not really, it doesn't seem like it's in the books anymore. But essentially to be propped up. I mean, there's also this thing, there's this embassy, the American embassy in Beirut, in the like north of Beirut. The new one that they sort of have been building for years, it is terrifying. It is a compound. It is like, it's not a compound, it's a fucking complex that like takes over an entire mountain. This is not just a place to get visas. Like, this is clearly like an outpost, like a surveillance, security, intelligence, military outpost. Also, Iran has kind of fucked off and it's doing its own thing. I think it's trying really hard to do some nuclear deal. In general, there is a collapse of what was known the so-called Axis. And on top of all of this, Hariri has come back. Saad Hariri, who like 2 years ago said he's dropping out of politics. This is a guy who's not only the son of the former prime minister, a very important prime minister, I should add, who was like credited with the reconstruction of the country, of the economy in the 90s after the Civil War. But this lays like with Hariri, like Rafiq Hariri, this is the sort of like beginning of the new phase of the class war in Lebanon. With the end of the Civil War, with all the sectarian parties, kind of, the agreement is, okay, fine, we all get different parts of the state and we can all basically rip off the rest of the fucking country, you know what I mean? We can all get super wealthy. Like, that's the arrangement. That's how they kind of like, there was no longer that much money to be made from the war economy, and then it became this kind of like liberal, clientelist economy. Lebanon before had already been a kind of liberal whatever, but Hariri really fucking opened up the country. And it was under his first sort of administration that the Lebanese lira was pegged to the dollar. This, like, is the major step in liberalizing the economy, because it means there's like so much access to foreign goods, but that means it harms industry, which is what it did, alongside like violently putting down labor protests, but also, yeah, benefited the bourgeoisie greatly. And it was the thing that essentially collapsed in 2019 and 2020. And now we're at a phase of like hyperinflation. And because we produce nothing, it makes no sense that our like it was a kind of the peg was fabricated. There was nothing that was really keeping it together. That's a whole fucking shit show. But basically, he was assassinated in 2005. Again, like either by Assad or by Hezbollah. This, I don't know if it's a hot take. I think that's pretty established. But regardless, so his son then becomes prime minister like 3 times. He was the prime minister that we overthrew, in 2019. He kind of resigned because, public protests and public pressure. He's made a kind of comeback. And February 14, like a week ago, he gives this big speech wherein he's back. And with the fall of Assad, who he, and he's like, the murder of my father is now gone. So there's like a return to form of essentially Haririism, which, again, like I should stress, like Hariri is always seen as a kind of compromise candidate. He's someone that a lot of people could play around with or could use. So like when he was prime minister last, it was under like a totally like Hezbollah, Amal dominated government, like with their Christian allies, the Free Patriotic Movement. And so he was this kind of compromise candidate who was like, I don't know, Sunni politics is fucked up. And there's really not many other people who could, say, fill his shoes in that kind of sectarian elite way. But yeah, he's his whole politics is essentially the same as his father. And that cannot stand. That is not what we need at all. That is part of the fucking problem. That is one of the core things of the problem. And we're not going to resolve the kind of collapse of Haririism with more Haririism, So that happened a week ago, came back to whatever, which again is connected to, like, why are they so emboldened? Not just because of Hezbollah, but also because of the fall of Assad. So you know what I mean? Like, that's another shift. Another shift, which I think is still kind of constantly unraveling, is the essentially accelerated aggression and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. With Trump as well, where it's like open acknowledgement of there is a plan now to like kick out the Palestinians, to literally complete the kind of like second full Nakba. I think there are some Israeli politicians who call the decision by Ben-Gurion, the prime minister of Israel, who kind of returned to office or returned to political life in 1967, they call it the big mistake. The big mistake of annexing or like occupying Gaza and the West Bank, as opposed to kicking them all out, and like literally doing exactly what they did in 1948. And so correcting that mistake. And basically that is completely connected with the kind of emboldened and like brazen US imperialism and Israeli colonialism, settler colonialism, and violence and expansionism. And yeah, I mean, that is something that honestly cannot be understated, because what has all of this been connected to? It was Gaza. When Hezbollah decided to open up this, what they described as the Solidarity Front on October 8th, like, the thing was, stop the war in Gaza and we will stop. And that didn't manifest. The Israelis did not stop and were not stopped. And instead, like, turned north and, like, it ceased to be a support front. It became a full-on fucking war. And so the genocide in Gaza, the genocide in Palestine, I think will invariably, constantly breed incredible amounts of frustration. And without that being resolved, and obviously seeing what they've done to Gaza, but also knowing the history of Zionism's, like of Palestine's encounter with Zionism, that the question of resolving is very deep. It's not just a ceasefire. This is the liberation I'm talking about. Basically, I think without the liberation of Palestine, there will be no sovereignty for any of us. In Lebanon, in Syria, and even in Jordan. I mean, sovereignty here takes a different meaning because they have sovereignty, but as in a kind of actual fucking liberation, like an actual, like, ability to control one's life. Because I don't think people are actually sovereign under a fucking, like, monarchy that is, like, super fucking Zionist and super, like, Western backed and whatever, and is just held up with this, like, brutal carceral system, more so Egypt. And I don't know. I think that honestly has been the dilemma, the problem in the region, stretching back 70 years, that sovereignty without liberation is not possible. And here liberation does not just mean liberation of the south of Lebanon, but also of Palestine, but also of, like, occupied territories in Syria. And honestly, liberation from all these fucking Arab regimes who are just bad. I don't know how to describe it. They're fucked. They're their own sources of oppression and violence and class domination. And there's really, there's no sovereignty, any meaningful sovereignty. And here I think sovereignty takes on a different meaning, not just as a state, but as individuals, as communities. And so basically where we find ourselves now in Lebanon is in a moment of increased US-Israeli hegemony, and with very few options. And I see some of the discourse kind of returning to a kind of basic sectarianism or campism, relying on certain slogans, or, like, not really being kind of coherent, at least, because I just don't see it. And I'm trying to be very fucking earnest and, like, present and vulnerable. Like, we need fucking solutions. We need analysis. This is my thing. It's that, like, it doesn't feel like there's space between those expressing euphoria and those, I don't know how to describe it, and I don't want to be dismissive, but kind of, I don't know, not being clear of their intentions, or kind of speaking from a place of very fucking valid frustration and opposition. But I think backing certain horses who they themselves have backed wrong horses, who have had failures, who might not be, the places where we should be pinning our solidarities. And what alternatives we have to them, I don't know. Definitely not my place to say. I mean, my place to say, but definitely not something I can just come up with now on this fucking podcast called Politically Depressed, as a depressed fucking whatever. Especially when we just do not have a kind of basis to talk about things. But yeah, there is definitely not just the sort of, like, US-Israeli hegemony, but a kind of, there's a certain delusion. But also, how do I say this? The Lebanese bourgeoisie are very excited at the moment, I think. And I mean, the Lebanese bourgeoisie is a very broad statement. Obviously, it's a big group, and it itself is divided. But the bourgeois elites, I think, have a lot to gain in this moment, and they're quite giddy about it. And they're quite giddy because they have nothing to gain, or at least they think they have nothing to gain, from the actual work of liberation. And in terms of, like, defending our land, literally, from occupation, there's no real strategy for it. And it's just kind of like, oh, good, if we can keep that in the south, or if we can keep that in Palestine, even fucking better. which I think is atrocious, but also is short-sighted, and is part of the kind of failures and problems and limitations of the entire state structure system in the region. Again, as I said in the offset, fully born of a kind of colonial division anyway. I talk about that a lot in the video essay. And so I see people, the only people I've been seeing kind of posting some analysis have been sharing things from Al Akhbar, which again it's like a lefty, it's like the most left-wing paper in Lebanon, at least used to be, but for the last 10, 15 years has been just super pro-Assad and super into the so-called axis of resistance. And I don't think, I think part of the reason why I think people can't hold this is because I think there is still this kind of present kind of conception that, I don't know, what happened in Syria was a regime change from abroad, or that it's the Israelis that did it, as opposed to the Assad regime was a horrible fucking regime that was bound to fall. If we believe that oppression breeds resistance, that oppression never lasts, as we do with the Zionists, with Western imperialism, then we see this with these dictators as well. And first and foremost with Assad, because fucking hell, after he fell, we saw the insides of Saidnaya. I'm still not fucking over that. We saw the inside of Saidnaya prison. And this is a thing that lived in the minds of every single Syrian. The realities of it. And so people who had been defending the Assad regime were wrong. Were wrong to do so. Ethically, politically, strategically. There were certain visions of this regime which are just manufactured. And so I don't see the shift in the discourse that's gone with this seismic shift of the collapse of the Assad regime, with the revelation of what many of us had already been saying. I mean, I don't know how much credence I should give to this report, but I think generally it's probably pretty true. It kind of makes a lot of sense. Part of the reasons why Hezbollah's security was so breached initially was because they were engaged in Syria, that they had to share intelligence and collaborate with Syrians who were their bureaucracy is fucked and it's probably riddled with Israeli spies. The Iranians with different militias, with the Russians. And so they were able to breach the security that way. And I don't know how direct or how immediately true it is, but it's definitely something. I mean, it kind of reminds me of how part of the reason that Abdel Nasser lost so terribly in 1967 is because he spent the last few years with tens of thousands of soldiers in Yemen. Anyway. So I think going forward, we are going to have a lot of conversations. We are going to have to say things as they are. We are going to have to be very fucking uncomfortable, which I am right now. And I don't think I've said anything that controversial. But there is a constant hesitancy to say kind of anything that isn't towing the line of either side. I mean, I'm much more comfortable kind of shitting on people who talk about sovereignty or the state or whatever than I am with people who are critical of them, but I think not in a way that I think is, I don't know, comprehensive or that fits in with what we've seen in the last few years. What we know of these parties, what we know of these factions, what we know of these histories. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to go off too much. I do want to leave more room to kind of contemplate with what I've said here. Because, again, I want to emphasize this, even though I know for a lot of people this means nothing. And for a lot of people that might be whatever about certain things I've said, there's a kind of, I don't know. I am coming from a place of understanding the genuine fucking need right now for liberation. For liberation from occupation, from Zionism, from imperialism, from bourgeois class domination, from patriarchal domination. Like, the reason I get so worked up and the reason that I feel like it's so necessary to say this is because I think we are in a fucking dire situation. And so any of my concerns of saying something, I'm being very considerate and sensitive. I'm not going off and giving hot takes just for the clicks. I am genuinely trying very hard to find an analysis and express analysis and share my thoughts out of literal, like, a place of solidarity and love for my people, whom I consider a quite broad group. But I think literally because things are so dire and so urgent that I need to put aside petty concerns of being called out, of cancelled. But regardless, I consider it a duty to at least say things as they are, to at least just say out loud what I see happening. Like, regardless of analysis, regardless of opinion or belief or ideology, I just want to, I consider that a duty to the martyrs, to the people who are still continuously living under occupation, that it is not the time to sort of like back away and feel that embarrassment or that shyness or that fear, but rather to kind of use that to sort of like, I don't know. And so I know I haven't said anything that kind of direct in this episode. Maybe I have and I just didn't realize it. But I think there's a lot going on and things are very intense. And that necessitates, to me, a very like real need for a critical analysis. Like, I don't think this is intellectual masturbation. I don't think this is something that's just like, I don't know. Like, I actually think this is fucking necessary. And I really hope to see more of it, like an actual engagement, like not just slogans and not just kind of, I don't know, to me, like short-sighted kind of, or like hot takes. I fucking hate hot takes. We cannot afford hot takes in this present moment. Hot takes do not form a movement. Hot takes do not, I don't know, liberate us. Analysis is part of the work of liberation. This I've learned from, I don't know, people like Bell Hooks or like Fanon or fucking, I don't know, like a lot of people, but like it's, I don't know, it's not separate. So, yeah, I think I said everything I wanted to say. Like I said in the offset, there will be a live stream happening this Sunday, 8 p.m. CET, if you want to come and tell me I'm talking shit, or ask me a question, or hear me talk more about the Lebanese entity, Zionism, Syria, maybe a bit about Hezbollah, but I'm like honestly a bit worried about talking too much about it. Especially because, I don't know if people know, but during the Civil War, there was this like constant, whenever like one party would be doing, or like one group or one militia or whatever, like once the balance of power started like shifting, different alliances started happening to kind of balance it back out. And I see that kind of happening with people seeing like a kind of weakened Hezbollah, so there's like more of a kind of mobilization or whatever. But also because, like, regardless of critiques of it, there's not a feeling from other parties or from other groups of any serious discussions or like strategies vis-a-vis the occupation of the South, vis-a-vis Zionism, vis-a-vis the region, vis-a-vis American imperialism, because it's fucked and it'll come after all of us, and we're all so fucked under the US boot. And I don't know. If I were to paint a kind of vision, I'm going to say something very briefly about that, just so it's not like pure, critique. But it's utopic, like no matter what. I think we're in a moment wherein any alternative is a kind of utopia. But I do envision the kind of like a proliferation of like grassroots community-based entities, political and economic, that then collaborate in a kind of confederation. Honestly, I think a lot about, and I've said this a lot before, and I know I haven't talked enough about them, but the resistance committees in Sudan and the local councils in Syria, to me, are these examples of things that aren't just necessities during moments of like revolution and war, but a kind of vision of a redivision of power beyond the state, outside of the state, that to me kind of can signal shifts or like push away from the kind of colonial division of the region, the kind of class domination within these nation states. But that's all a big pipe dream, especially in this moment of like completely emboldened US imperialism. So like regardless of my critiques of this or that group, this is the reality. And it's a reality some don't want to confront, but that's home. So, thank you all for listening. That was another episode of Politically Depressed. I hope you enjoyed that one. If you want to support this podcast, and please do, there's a tip jar below, which I'd really appreciate, even if just for $5. It really helps kind of boost my self-esteem, but also literally keeps this project going. If you want to support on a monthly basis, there's the Patreon. You also get access to a lot of cool stuff if you become a member. For as little as $5 a day, a month, $5 a day. And yeah, like and subscribe. Leave a rating wherever you're listening to this podcast. It can only take a few seconds. And most importantly, tell your friends, tell your family, and help spread the word. So yeah, that's it from me, and I'll see you all next time.